Is Detroit the worst city in America? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. That all depends on who you are, I'm pretty sure. I'll be breaking down some of the great things that I know about Detroit and then also some of the tough stuff that you hear all the time, giving you a little bit if it's true to it or not. And then you can make a decision on where Detroit ranks in your book. I'm Ed Butler. I'm a local realtor that makes videos about the city of Detroit and the surrounding areas. If you want to know more about that, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below. But let's hop into the video now. So something common and random I get from people all the time is, what is there to do in Detroit? Like, all I hear in Detroit is this some type of war-torn gangland that you never want to step into, or the shadowy place in The Lion King. Well, that's not quite true. There's literally a ton of stuff to do right here in the city of Detroit and the surrounding areas, but we'll just focus on the city of Detroit. Like, no matter what walk of life you're in, you probably can find your place inside the city limits of Detroit. Let's take, for instance, where one that has a lot of history in Detroit, the music scene. If music's your thing and festivals and stuff like that, then you'll probably have a great time at the Electric Forest Festival that's this year. It's actually in June, and the tickets are already sold out right now. Or if techno's your space, because this is the birthplace of techno, then the Movement Music Festival is probably going to be your jam. Beyond that, if you like sports, you kind of a guy like me, we got all 4 major sports right here in the city limits of Detroit, almost walking distance of each other. Really, they actually are walking distance of each other. And that's going to be basketball, baseball, football, and of course, hockey. Maybe none of that other stuff is your thing, and you're just like, look, dude, I want gambling, I want nightclubs, I want wild parties and entertainment. Well, cool, we got that for you too. We have 3 casinos right downtown. Each of them almost has a nightclub within them, but there's definitely nightclubs within walking distance of them and predominantly dispersed around the city as well. And then you got a ton of restaurants interspersed, either in the casinos, outside the casinos. It seems like there's a new restaurant on the higher end or lower end popping up every week in Detroit. So in actuality, things to do is definitely not something that you have to worry about in the city of Detroit. It's kind of cool though, because it's not like, hey, you just go wandering around and you know exactly what you're gonna bump into. It's kind of like, you know, the best spots, you gotta know somebody or you gotta know where to go. And I think that's kind of cool. Another one people pop up to me is like, hey, what's going on with the job market? I heard the economy is really slow, can't find a job, people can't work, that's why so much poverty in Detroit. Well, that's not all the way true either. It is true that 1/3 of the population in the city of Detroit is at or below the poverty line. But there's many factors that go into that and the reason why that it is, but I can save that for another video. But what is true, in recent times, there's been a lot of revitalization in the city and a lot of outside investment from cities around the nation. Rocket Mortgage and Dan Gilbert and his team is definitely one of them. He has probably about 4 or 5 brands that will operate inside the city of Detroit under the Rocket Mortgage umbrella, and they invest heavily into the city. I mean, this guy almost owns half of the city of Detroit, it feels like, downtown at least. Then you go on to the big 3 automakers. GM's headquarters is definitely downtown. Ford has a new innovation center and complex that they're building downtown, replacing the old Michigan Central train station. So they'll be downtown heavily as well. Other Fortune 500 companies like Ally Financial, Lear Corporation, Google. In addition to these Fortune 500 companies, Detroit has become home to a lot of startups and healthcare companies as well. Besides these Fortune 500 companies, Detroit is home to an emerging healthcare sector, tech startups, and then overall entrepreneurial startups as well. This is overall adding to the revitalization in the job market of the city, and it's on a upward trend. And with the Detroit being on an upward trend like that, it's making it a very attractive destination for other companies to come on in, invest in the city on the ground floor, and make it up in the long run. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this one, especially because we're currently in probably the worst season that we have here in Michigan, and that's going to be the weather. People think Detroit is almost Antarctica, which is really not the case. I mean, we're not even the coldest city in the Midwest. Like, you go ahead and going up to Minnesota for that one. But there's no way around it, really. It does get pretty cold in the winter in Detroit. It does get a lot of snow from time to time, but it's way less than it was when I was growing up here. I mean, this right now is like a desert vacation compared to how it was when I was growing up. Thanks, global warming. But what I will say on the weather is that you'll be hard pressed to find a different city with just as nice of a summer on the water as Detroit. This especially makes it really cool because we have a lot of green spaces. We actually have our own island where you can go out there and enjoy the riverfront views all around, and we have a lot of riverfront housing and condos as well. Also, Detroit is home to the #1 riverwalk in the country, so don't forget about that. But overall, if you're that averse to cold, then Detroit probably just not for you. But us people that enjoy the 4 seasons, we're gonna bask in its glory. The next one I hear about is, hey, the housing market. This is definitely near and dear to my heart and my specialty as a realtor. And there's no way around it as well. Detroit did take it pretty hard in the last economic downturn in 08. It's definitely one of the cities that took it the hardest, and it feels like prices dropped overnight. But that pretty much was felt all over the country and pretty much every city for the most part. Since then, Detroit has been on a steady incline like most of the country, but even a little bit sharper in Detroit because we're probably the most undervalued city in the entire country. And people are starting to notice. People are starting to look around and say, wow, like of the major cities, Detroit's definitely the most affordable. There's a lot of good stuff happening in there. You wouldn't believe how many investors that call me on a day-to-day basis about investing in the city of Detroit because they see what's going on, whether the rest of us Detroiters or people that's close to it see it or not. Also, something that contributed to the downturn a little bit in the housing market was that Detroit was overly dependent on the big 3 automakers for employment. And that's changed a lot with the introduction of all these new companies that are starting to invest in Detroit for the future. As I mentioned before, we're definitely a big hub for the mortgage industry right now with Rocket Mortgage and then United Wholesale Mortgage as well. 2 of the largest mortgage lenders in the country. So when it comes to housing, getting in on Detroit right now is still a good time. I mean, the only better time was probably 5 years ago. And in another 5 years, I'll be saying the same thing about the day and age right now, most likely. I say this because a crash is very unlikely in the city of Detroit because, like I said, we're one of the most undervalued markets as it is. So compared to the rest of the country, we got a good ways to go to catch up. Last but certainly not least, you can't talk about Detroit without debunking or talking about the crime. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's all cherries and rainbows and that Detroit's the safest place in the world, because that just wouldn't be true, and you can't really say that of almost any city in America. What I will tell you is that Detroit does still rank in the tops of crimes committed in cities, but it's nowhere out of place from other major cities just like it. And a fun fact is that New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Houston, Texas have more violent crimes than Detroit. So if you're looking at any of those cities, you shouldn't be more afraid to be in one of those than you would be in Detroit. Also, it's very important to consider that when it comes to crime statistics, it doesn't take into account neighborhood by neighborhood crime variations. And that comes into play a lot because certain small pockets of neighborhoods account for a ton of the crime, and that kind of blends the statistics on paper. So it doesn't really give you a full view of the situation. So my recommendation is find out what areas that you really want to be in, do your research from multiple areas to get you a more well-rounded view of what's going on from a crime standpoint. And just know that if you're moving to a major city, that's just going to be something that comes along with the territory. No place is perfect, and you just got to do your best to avoid dangerous situations and don't put yourself in harm's way. These are a few reasons that I hear most commonly of people saying why they're on the fence about Detroit. So I hope you got a little bit out of it and learned a little bit more and put a little color on some of these questions that you may have. Detroit definitely is not going to be for everybody, but it's nowhere near the worst city in America. Honestly, biased opinion, I think it's one of the best cities in America, or it definitely will be one day, and we'll rightfully get our respect one of these days. So to a certain sector, it's not going to be for them. And then for the people who Detroit is for, you're going to look back one day and understand that something beautiful is taking place right before your eyes. And you're going to be able to look back and say, man, I love how far we've come along, and I was a part of that. And as always, if you're looking for more content just like this, make sure you go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below, drop a like on the video, and I'll catch you on the next one.